Hey, what is up guys, Merganman4 here, and today I'm going to be giving you my thoughts and opinions on the iconic 10th season of Doctor Who. It was certainly a special year for the show, celebrating a decade of adventures with the very first multi-Doctor story, as well as giving back the Doctor's freedom to travel through time and space, including the unplanned final appearance of Roger Delgado as the Master, and of course the departure of iconic companion Jo Grant. There's a lot to unpack with this season, so let's get right into it. It's no easy task to maintain high-quality storytelling after a decade on the air, but thankfully Season 10 is up to the task, giving us a number of fun, exciting, and memorable stories, and it's definitely a highlight of the classic era. If not for the stories themselves, certainly for the continually superb leads. Either way, Season 10 isn't going to be fading from the fan memory anytime soon, and what better way to kick off such an iconic season than by giving us the ultimate celebration, the meeting of the Doctors. It's been a decade since the show first graced our screens in 1963, and to celebrate, all three Doctors are finally brought together in a first for the series. Multi-Doctor specials are a lot more commonplace now, but when the three Doctors aired, this was a unique experience. Nothing like it had ever happened before in the Doctor Who universe. And even watching it back now, 45 years later, it still feels really special. It's a real shame that, considering this is the only multi-Doctor story that Cardinal himself ever had any involvement with, that he was too ill to actually take on a significant role. But what little contributions he does have are really lovely, and I'm glad that he was able to be involved in some way. And in terms of Patrick Troughton and Jon Pertwee, their interactions are just fantastic, and they make a great duo. They just shine together and make the entire story just a tremendous amount of fun. It's a shame then that the actual story itself isn't quite up to snuff. Omega does make for a really great villain, and there are a couple of fantastic scenes between him and the Doctors, but the story takes perhaps a little bit too long to get into full gear, and there are a couple of guest characters in Mr. Ollis and Dr. Tyler who just kind of seem there. They don't really serve much of a purpose other than to, I guess, flesh out the story a bit more, but they just feel like extra flab on the story. They don't need to be there. And of course the Gelguards, Omega's servants, they're just laughable to say the least. They were not executed very well. It's an alright story that has a wonderful gimmick, and it all balances out to something that, while it's not necessarily high quality, it is a story that is a huge amount of fun, and it's highly enjoyable every time I watch it. So I think for that, I'm going to be giving the Three Doctors a 7.5 out of 10. Carnival of Monsters is a story that is simply brimming with creativity. It's got a wacky plot that makes just enough sense to keep you engaged, but is also creative and out there enough to just let your imagination run wild. It features striking imagery via the shrinking provided by the miniscope, monsters galore, including a couple of cameos, and of course the infamous Drashigs, which are actually very well executed on the whole, and some fantastic characters that all have a great rapport with each other, and a lot of very memorable dialogue as well. This is a prime example of writer Robert Holmes at his finest, where the ideas are just let loose, and everything comes together beautifully to create this fantastically fun and unique final product. Carnival of Monsters isn't a perfect story, but it's definitely a highlight of the Pertwee era, and dare I say it, even of the classic era as a whole. Incredibly identifiable and memorable, and tons of fun. And for that, I'm going to be giving Carnival of Monsters an 8.5 out of 10. Frontier in Space is a story that always seems to rank amongst the Third Doctor's most iconic, and to be honest, I don't quite see why, although it certainly is a very solid tale. Even despite the incredibly repetitive capture-escape, capture-escape, capture-escape that goes on throughout practically the entire story, it still manages to be relatively entertaining throughout all 6 of its episodes. The guest characters are given some good depth, and the Draconian race itself is very well realized. Certainly a race I'd love to actually revisit at some point, and I'm honestly surprised in the last 45 years that the TV show has never come back to them. As well, the hints towards the Daleks' involvement are really sneakily done, very entertainingly so, even though ultimately not really much is done with that plot point. This is the only story until The Magician's Apprentice and Witch's Familiar in 2015, over 40 years later, where the Master actually interacts with the Daleks, and it's all relegated to near the end of the final episode, and barely anything is done with it, and then the story's over in a flash. So that is somewhat disappointing for something that should be really big. Jon Pertwee and Katy Manning provide an incredible double act throughout the whole thing. They are just fantastic as always, and there are very few Doctor Companion pairings that I think would enable you to get through so much capture escape as goes on here. I think the only reason it doesn't bother me as much as it probably should is because it's Jon Pertwee and Katy Manning, and their chemistry is just, oh, it's fantastic. As well, this story also features the unfortunate and unplanned final appearance of Roger Delgado as the Master. And while in that regard, it's a little bit underwhelming, like I said, it wasn't planned. This wasn't supposed to be his Master's final appearance. And there are still some pretty great moments between the Doctor and his arch-nemesis in this story. All in all, while Frontier in Space isn't a standout in my books, it is still pretty solid and relatively entertaining throughout the whole thing, so I'm going to be giving it a solid 7.5 out of 10. Terry Nation may have created the Daleks, but unfortunately I don't think he's the best at writing them, particularly the further away from their creation in 1963 that we get. That's not to say that Planet of the Daleks is necessarily bad per se, but it's definitely the season's most forgettable. To be honest, I don't have a whole lot to say about this story. There's a lot of aspects that are actually drawn from the very first Dalek story, but they're not done as well here. As well as the fact that the story's most interesting prospect, the Daleks trying to turn themselves invisible, is used for the cliffhanger of episode 1, but that's it. They mention it again, but that's the only time we ever see an invisible Dalek. That's a really neat and potentially terrifying concept that is never taken advantage of again for some reason. I also think it's a shame that the Dalek Supreme doesn't show up until the final episode, because it's actually a pretty neat design, and it would have been cool to see him a little bit earlier on as a bigger, more involved part of the story. Oh, and there's also this random subplot that's thrown in with a love story between Joe and one of the Thals that falls completely flat, especially since this story comes right before the Green Death. I guess pretty much all I've said about this story has been complaints, but honestly it's not all that bad. None of these things are too big of a deal. It's less of these are reasons why the story's bad, and more of these are reasons that prevent Planet of the Daleks from actually being up there with other Dalek stories. So I think I'm going to be giving Planet of the Daleks a 6.5 out of 10. And at last we find ourselves at the one with the maggots. I just have to say, right off the bat, this is a fantastic story, and I love it. The Green Death just works on so many levels. It's got a scary monster, some great action, a really chilling human villain, an evil maniacal supercomputer, a beautiful blooming romance, and genuinely one of the most touching and emotional companion exits in the show's entire history. It's just superb. Honestly, the CSO fringing is probably the only fault I can put against this story. Everything else is just fantastic. Unlike most companion romances, Joe and Cliff's feels completely natural, and the growing intimacy throughout the story feels properly earned. Jocelyn Stevens makes for a great villain, and Boss makes for an even greater, well, boss. And the Doctor's interactions with it are just fantastic and hugely entertaining. Massively helped by the fact that Boss is actually given a proper personality. The scene in episode 6 as well, where Stevens finally turns against Boss's control and actually acts against him is a genuinely emotional scene as well. You really feel for Stevens. And of course the final scene where Jo tells the Doctor that she's leaving him, that she's gonna stay with Cliff. Well, honestly, sometimes understatement is the way to go. The new series really could learn from that. This scene is only so powerful and effective because it's underplayed. It just feels so natural and somber. It's not over emotional. It doesn't go over the top. It's just two really great friends saying goodbye to each other. This is one of the most emotionally effective scenes in the show's history, not just because of the grand friendship Pertwee and Manning had on and off camera, but also because it's played to perfection, with the Doctor leaving without a word and driving off into the sunset in Bessie. And I'm not ashamed to say that the ending brought a tear or two to my eye. It's just wonderful. A really fantastic story in pretty much every regard. And without a doubt, one of my favorite Pertwee stories. Easily a 9 out of 10 for me. "46 years on, Season 10 holds up incredibly well, and gives us some great stuff for the 10th anniversary of the show. Jon Pertwee and Katy Manning are never better, and if it wasn't clear by this point, Season 10 sets in stone just how iconic this duo is. Their chemistry is among the best of any Doctor-companion pair, and you can tell that they just love every minute of it. A fabulous return of the first two Doctors, iconic aliens and monsters, hugely creative and entertaining stories, for the most part, and an incredibly affectionate companion farewell. I have to admit, before this season was released on Blu-ray, it didn't really mean a whole lot to me as a whole, despite some independently excellent stories. But now, watching them all together, it really is an iconic season, and definitely one well worth remembering. And now, with our 4th season in the mix, our statistics are starting to look a lot more interesting now that we have a lot more stories to compare between. As always, we'll start with comparing the stories within Season 10, and then see how Season 10 fares against the other 3 seasons. Of course, the top spot is taken by The Green Death with a 9 out of 10, followed by Carnival of Monsters with an 8.5 out of 10, Frontier in Space and the 3 Doctors each follow with a 7.5 out of 10, and in the last place is Planet of the Daleks with a 6.5 out of 10. This brings Season 10's average score to an impressive 7.8 out of 10, the highest so far. And now comparing it to other seasons, Season 10 swiftly steals the top spot from Season 18. With its help, the 70s now reaches an average of 7.5 out of 10, while Jon Pertwee's era is introduced at the top with 7.8 out of 10. When it comes to writers, Robert Sloman and Barry Letts, who went uncredited on The Green Death, take second spot with a 9 out of 10, followed by Robert Holmes now in third with an 8.75 out of 10, Terry Nation in 8th with a 7.75 out of 10, then Malcolm Hulke in 8th with a 7.5 out of 10, and finally Bob Baker and Dave Martin now in 11th with a 7.25 out of 10. In terms of producers, Barry Letts keeps the top spot going up to a 7.6 out of 10, while in terms of script editors, Terrence Dicks easily takes the top spot with a 7.8 out of 10. Next we have directors with Barry Letts at the top with an 8.5 out of 10, David Maloney now in 7th with a 7.75 out of 10, Paul Bernard and Lenny Mayne each following with a 7.5 out of 10, and Michael E. Bryan rising to a 6.25 out of 10. Of course, we also have our event episodes where Season 10 qualifies in both the premiere and finale categories. The 3 Doctors manages second in premieres, with the category's average slightly raising to a 7.1 out of 10, while The Green Death takes the top spot in finales without any competition, bringing that category's average up to a still disappointing 5.3 out of 10. And our first 2 seasons really messed that one up. We've also now amassed enough stories to create both a top 10 and a bottom 10. And so from here on out, I'm going to be closing each review with where the respective reviewed season's stories will go in the total ranking, as well as making special mention if any stories breach the top or bottom of that ranking. For our top 10, we begin with Earthshock, followed by Kinda, Genesis of the Daleks, The Green Death, The Ark in Space, Carnival of Monsters, Warrior's Gate, State of Decay, The Leisure Hive, and The Visitation. Season 10 taking 2 of those spots. As for the bottom 10, we start with Logopolis in 10th. Clearly we have quite a ways to go until it's actually filled with all bad stories. Then we have Megalos, The Sontaran Experiment, Planet of the Daleks, The Keeper of Traken, Black Orchid, Castrovalva, Fort of Doomsday, Revenge of the Cybermen, and Time Flight at the bottom. Season 10 only has 1 entry in the bottom 10, with every other season reviewed so far having at least 2. Finally, in terms of total ranking, The Green Death makes it to 4th, Carnival of Monsters is in 6th, Frontier in Space and the Three Doctors are back-to-back in 11th and 12th, and finally Planet of the Daleks is in 18th. That's all out of 24. And with that, we conclude my review of Doctor Who's 10th season. An incredibly enjoyable one filled with memorable moments and superb stories. Certainly lives up to expectations. But with that, I hope you enjoyed, and please leave your thoughts on Doctor Who Season 10 down in the comments below. Morganman4, over and out, and I'll see you guys later.